When Brian opened his eyes, it was still dark outside. The house was quiet, and there was nothing in the air that could have been the cause of his awakening. Judging by his skin, the air was cool and comfortable, a typical early summer morning in the Northeast. No point in waiting, he thought. The bedside clock showed 5:11 a.m. Well, there's something to do. He threw back the blanket and stretched out his legs. The wooden floor was cool but not unpleasant. A momentary pause, and then he stood up. The sensation of rising made him nostalgic. It was strange that such a thing as getting out of bed could evoke such a feeling, but it was a new day, and with it a change in his life. Off to the bathroom. As I did my morning ablutions, thoughts and expectations ran through my mind. What will change for me after this? And my body just moved, doing everything by inertia and muscle memory. Should I get dressed? Brian decided to wear a decent shirt and pants, but nothing too flashy. It was typical of what he wore to work. Professional, but since he often wore a lab coat or various personal protective equipment, a suit didn't make sense. Once dressed, he went downstairs and went to the kitchen to put the kettle on. He didn't know if he had any tea. Towards 6 in the morning, he took the last of the eggs out of the refrigerator and made an omelet out of them. A lonely man's refrigerator was often empty, and Brian's was no exception. However, he had deliberately not restocked, simply based on the uncertainty of the journey he was about to embark on. There was no point in stocking up on a bunch of food that he might not need. There was so much uncertainty in all of this. But his guests weren't too generous with details. It was still another hour or so before they arrived. On the table lay a business card, black, with the name in white Gothic script on the front, Corax and Groom. He ran his finger along the edge of the business card before turning it over. The lettering made his eyes hurt. The back was a mirror image of the front, all white with black Gothic script. Wrong inscription. Very strange. He could have sworn something else had been written here last time, but the misspelling made him chuckle. There was no contact information. There was no address or any other information about the band. Actually, the card itself was probably the least strange part of how this whole chain of events had started. Next chapter. A few months ago, at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday evening, Brian was sitting in the Yardarm pub near the waterfront with a mug of beer in his hand. Not to say he was a regular, but the other regulars at the Yardarm could tell the day of the week by what drink Brian was choosing. Longneck homebrew was the sign of Wednesday. Friday, bourbon and water. Saturday, a full glass of Shiraz. For him, it was a little entertainment to dilute the monotony of heavy drinking. If he drank the same thing every night, it would be too easy to call him a drunk. As it was, he was just eccentric. Not that he had anywhere to go or anyone to go with. No, Kristen took care of that, and took care of it very efficiently. So it was either the yardarm and Mitch behind the bar and whoever was there that night, or the house staring at the walls and drinking himself into oblivion. He decided that if he was going to go crazy, he'd rather do it in company. The bar staff was used to the pleas of lonely hearts, their heartbreaking stories as if they were speaking to a jury. More often than not, the storyteller was the aggrieved party and just wanted their complaints heard and validated. Sometimes it was the guilty party seeking absolution. Brian's story was unknown. He simply politely declined to talk about why he was there so often. The closest he came to answering a question about his past was the phrase, "If you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all." He was polite and cordial to the yard staff, and they looked at him with warmth, sympathy, but also with some sadness. He didn't shy away from conversations with anyone, but he didn't seek to strike up one either. But in the nearly 3 years that he had been coming to the yard staff had sometimes realized from his strange appearance that he was ill. Nothing special in conversation or demeanor, but in the way he looked or focused his attention at certain moments. There was a sort of longing in his gaze, from which you could tell that he had once had something, but then lost it. Anyone who had worked in dive bars for any length of time had seen that look. This was a man reveling to death because he had nothing else to live for. The yard was quite crowded that night. Most of the tables were occupied, but there were no groups, and you could have quite reasonable conversations if you had someone to talk to. Brian sat alone, sipping his 4th mug of beer. He planned to drink 2 more before walking the 3 blocks to his second-floor apartment. He looked across the bar somewhere in the distance at no one or nothing. "Is this seat taken?" came a dry, squeaky voice from his right. He sensed an accent in it, something vaguely European but not quite identifiable. Coming out of his reverie, he turned and found himself at chest level with a man in a black suit and coat. Looking up, the face towering above him was rather long and thin. The word gaunt came to mind. A pronounced Roman nose sat between high cheekbones and sunken cheeks, above a thin, almost lipless mouth. Dark and deep-set eyes, almost entirely pupils, looked down at him. Long curly hair, probably in need of a shower, spread across his high forehead, framing his face to his jawline. A dark cap flaunted on his head. The man stared at Brian intently, as if the answer was vital, but he was also very still. No, help yourself. Brian suddenly wanted to look away from that face, so he looked again at the focal point in the middle distance and moved the bar stool slightly away from the empty stool the stranger was aiming for. The stool creaked as he moved. Thank you kindly. Brian nodded carelessly toward the man, but never met his dark eyes again. The so-tall man lowered himself easily into the seat, pulling his knees up so that they were just below the overhang of the bar. The posture reminded Brian of an impatient schoolboy leaning forward in his chair. The hat was removed and placed on the other side of the man. The man ordered hot tea from Mitch and pulled a small coin purse from under his dark coat. The fabric of the coat rustled quietly. Brian looked away, but found his attention fully focused on his conversation partner. With his peripheral vision, Brian saw long, bony fingers carefully remove the cup from the saucer and bring it to his mouth. A quick sip, and the cup was returned. This repeated several times until he could take no more. Funny, why come to the pub to have a cup of tea? Brian asked, looking straight in front of him. Why, indeed? Brian felt the man's lips reach for his face. He turned his head and saw a smirk. The man was looking where Brian was looking, directly in front of him, in the middle distance. Large teeth, yellowed and smooth as tombstones in a churchyard, framed thin, pale lips. Then, the man turned and looked at Brian, tilting his head slightly as his smile grew even wider and his lips stretched across the curve of his skull. It seemed like he had too many teeth in his mouth. I suppose it's all about the company, he continued, keeping his gaze on Brian and lifting his teacup to take another sip. Maybe it's about the conversation, if the conversation takes place. Mitch approached with the renewed tea. Thank you, sir, the man added cheerfully. He pulled a rough bronze coin with an amusing design from his wallet and swiped it across the counter. The movement was graceful and sly, like sleight of hand. The head turned to Brian again. That interests you, huh? Shall we talk? Brian felt drawn to this man, and the dialogue began, almost reluctantly. Okay, awkwardly. As if not knowing where to begin, he forced himself to turn in his seat toward the tall man. I'm Brian. Brian Wally. Large dark pores on the man's cheeks and jaw gave away his permanent 5 o'clock shadow. Hi, Brian Wally. I'm Korax. A large, pale hand grew from the sleeve of his overcoat and reached out to shake Brian's hand. Brian raised his eyebrows slightly. Just Korax, he said, answering the unasked question. Is that a Dutchman? Not that I know of. The wide grin was slightly alarming. What do you do, Mr. Brian Wally? Please, just Brian. Korax nodded in agreement. I'm a scientist, a microbiologist actually. Really? And what is it that you study? Well, it's pretty boring, but I run the operations department of a company that provides sterilization services. Korax blinked, waiting for him to continue. We receive products from other companies like medical and surgical supplies and the like, and then process them to make them sterile and safe for consumers. We destroy all the bacteria and all the nasty stuff that lives on the products. Most people's eyes glazed over when he talked about it, but not Korax's. I find it fascinating, Brian. Consider me benefiting from the fruits of your work. Korax's eyes sparkled, and his mouth turned into a strained smile, forcing Brian to take another sip of his beer. How does it work? You really want to know? It's okay for me, but a little boring. Definitely. Korax tilted his head, and he felt like he was under a microscope. We take a bulk product, packaging and all, put it in a sealed chamber and pump a very toxic gas called ethylene oxide into it. The gas seeps into the product through the packaging and kills all the microorganisms on the product. Doesn't it poison the person using it? The tall man was more interested than Brian had realized. Actually, no. Good question. He relaxed as he spoke. It was his comfort zone and he really enjoyed his job, even though many people found it boring. After the products are exposed, the gas is removed under vacuum and then clean air is reintroduced. We repeat this procedure several times to draw out a little more gas with each cycle. Eventually, all of it is removed. After a few hours, the product is completely safe to use. Gosh, that's just wonderful. You're killing so many things. He squeezed his long fingers and his head bobbed up and down in delight. Brian smiled awkwardly, an uneasy feeling on his face. Yeah, I never thought of that. Just delightful, that ethylene oxide. The sight of the man shuddering with delight at the thought was utterly creepy, yet strangely frank. Yeah, but like I said, it's nasty stuff. Not only does it kill everything it touches, but it's highly explosive. Wonderful, Korax cackled, a high and reedy sound, and his dark eyes sparkled. I think I like you, Brian. You've given me something to think about. Korax emptied his goblet and stood up, put on his hat and extended his long arm to Brian again. I have some business to attend to, but perhaps I could talk to you again, Brian? I think I'd like to know more about you. Brian was a little taken aback at such a strange conversation, but nodded nonetheless. Despite this man's unusual appearance and odd behavior, there was something honest and attractive about him. He didn't seem evil, he was just different. Plus, he diluted the monotony of sitting alone and slowly poisoning himself. Sure, I'm here regularly. And he smiled genuinely for the first time. Of course you're here. Korax nodded and headed for the door. He noticed that Korax had to duck his head as he walked out the door. He also noticed the other guests looking after the tall, strange man as he left. Mitch walked over and cleaned the teacup and saucer, picking up the change. He looked at the coins in his hand and did a double take, eyes wide as he did the saucer in his hand. Brian shrugged his shoulders. Mitch scurried off to the corner to look at the coins under the bright light and then scattered them in his pockets. Brian finished his beer and headed home, but most of the time he had a smirk on his face, for the first time in a long time. Next chapter. It was another 2 weeks before the strange man Korax met Brian again at the shipyard, this time on Tequila Sunrise Tuesday. For the first few nights, Brian expected to see his strange interlocutor. Once alone, he just drank. Excessively, even by his own standards. After that weekend, Brian returned to his normal level of alcohol consumption. Brian was immersed in his own world when a voice sounded beside him. Brian, is this seat taken? Almost a repeat of their first meeting, Brian was startled by the presence beside him before inviting the visitor to sit down. Korax lowered himself into a chair in a strange, bird-like manner, kneeling just below the bar. His hat was placed on the bar. Are you staying here, Mr. Korax? Brian called out to Mitch to bring tea. Thank you, Brian. No, I'm not staying here. I'm passing through here on my duties. And please, if we're going to socialize, I'm just Korax. Mitch placed a cup of tea in front of him. Korax let the bag brew, then put it away. What do you do, Korax? A pause followed. I do a lot of things, but to be honest, I'm a traveler. Here and there, here and there, here and there, he said, with a slight sing-song. He sipped his tea and smiled slightly. Ah, import, export. That's what it is. Setting the cup down, he reached for his overcoat. Digging in his pocket, he pulled out a business card. Korax and Groom, in white lettering on a black card. Brian examined it. His eyes glazed over as he read the words, if that was even possible. Turning it over, he saw a white card with black letters. Movement for all. I hear there's good money to be made on this. Brian beckoned for another pour. Really? I think it's more of a calling. Those big teeth and an awkward smile. But it's not without its rewards. And who's Groom? Groom is my partner. Brian waited a bit for an explanation. Not waiting for it, he asked, And? Ah, yes, I apologize. I can be very forgetful in conversation sometimes. Korax beckoned for more tea to be poured, and a moment later pulled a purse from his coat. If I were the face of the organization, Groom would be the back end. He handles, shall we say, the operational part of the service. Mitch waited in front of Korax while long, thin fingers pulled out two oddly sized, dull silver coins and placed them on the counter. Brian didn't recognize them, but Mitch practically jumped up to pick them up. Mitch stepped back again to study the coins on the other side of the bar. Korax had just brewed a pot of tea. Groom traveling with you? Mitch could practically hear Korax's thin lips stretch into a smirk. Oh yes, he was supposed to join me. Service requires the two of us. A gulp. Is he here? Yes. Korax glanced angrily at Brian. Where? He asked, looking around for someone who looked like Korax. Outside. As if that answered all questions. Why isn't he coming in? Brian turned his head, trying to see Grum outside. Well, like I said, I'm taking care of business on duty. Korax turned to Brian. His gaze became softer and more understanding. Either that, or Brian was already used to Korax's strange look and mannerisms. The groom is happy to stay out of the way of customers until he's needed, and then, well, he does what he has to do. Brian pondered this while Korax finished his tea. Standing up, Korax said, This is where we should part ways, Brian. Oh, okay, work? Yes, my duties are constant. Never busy and all that. Korax raised his index finger upward as if reciting his business motto. Well, I wish you good luck. I've enjoyed our conversation, Korax. Yes, Brian. I've enjoyed it too. I'll be there earlier this time, assuming I plan it right, of course, which I usually do. I hope to talk to you again in the meantime. He nodded to Mitch, who immediately looked over to see if there was anything else he could do to help Korax. Great, Brian saluted the receding figure with his empty Collins glass. Give my regards to Mr. Groom. Korax turned around. A pause. Done, he said with a nod. That's very kind since he doesn't get to meet people as often as I do. Thank you, Brian. You're welcome. With those words, the tall figure ducked under the door frame and out the door, disappearing into the night. Surprisingly pleased with the conversation and potential friend, Brian picked up the simple business card Korax had left behind and studied it, despite his slight discomfort. Looking up, he saw Mitch placing a fresh drink in front of him. On the house, Mitch grinned. Just keep bringing your friend here. Brian wanted to ask, but decided he'd better not. Gift horses and all that. By the end of the night, Brian could barely walk and collapsed right in front of his apartment door. He woke up with a sour stomach and a sore head, but still made it to work on time. Damn tequila. Next chapter. It was a week before Korax showed up at the yard and, after being invited to come in, sat down next to Brian. What's up, Korax? Mitch brought a teacup with a small teapot for brewing, which held loose tea leaves and boiling water separately. Was there a twist to it? A unique set of services for infrequent customers? Brian looked at Mitch, puzzled as to where the new level of service came from. Mitch was only paying attention to the long, lean figure of his companion. The bartender's gaze followed the hand reaching into his coat pocket for his wallet. This time, a dull, oddly shaped coin, tarnished, gilded in places, lay on the counter, which Mitch immediately took, thanking him as he left. Pretty busy, but I happened to be in the neighborhood and my colleague Groom reminded me that he sends his regards to you, so here I am. Please thank him for me. A nod and a smirk indicated he would. It would be my pleasure. Listen, you seem to be here quite often. Is that true? Brian nodded. Is there any reason for that? Shouldn't a man like you be with family? Brian froze under his intense gaze for a moment, contemplating whether to discuss the subject. In all the years he had come to the yard, he had never discussed why he was here, why he was slowly drinking himself to death, or why he would never be with a woman again. But there was a uniqueness to these thoughts of Korax. This was a man who was completely outside of Brian's world. If he revealed his story, Korax wouldn't be able to repeat it to anyone else. Brian's embarrassment and shame would not be passed on to his coworkers or anyone else. The very nature of the story was a heavy burden. Carrying something so poisonous around without being able to get rid of it was torture in itself. After reflecting on it, he decided to tell his interlocutor something he hadn't spoken to anyone about in years. No family, no wife. He took a sip, preparing himself for the unpleasant task ahead. At least there's no wife now. It's a short story. Korax tilted his head and leaned forward with genuine interest. I have some free time and it seems you have a story to tell. Please continue. I will be a patient listener. Next chapter? I met Kristen at work about 20 years ago. I lived on the other side of the country and was a staff microbiologist at another sterilization company where I did lab work and provided customers with test results. During a performance review, the operations manager promoted me from lab technician to shift supervisor. This meant a pay raise and increased responsibility. I gladly accepted. Things were going well at the plant and our business was expanding. So one of my first assignments was to work with my boss, the plant manager, to expand production. I was single and although I dated occasionally, I was very career-focused, so serious relationships just didn't exist for me. The first project I was involved in was that the company needed to add new sterilization chambers and hire additional staff to handle the workload. The sterilization process itself is very dangerous because ethylene oxide gas is very toxic and explosive, so building a new facility was a nightmare of permits, bureaucracy, and safety inspections. But over time, with a lot of effort, we built the facility and hired new employees. One of the new employees was a young engineer named Kristen Urshaki. She was of medium height with fine facial features and a slender, athletic build. Nothing too big or small, everything in its place. I found her very attractive without being a model. She was hired to work directly on the floor, overseeing a process that basically involved moving a customer's product into chambers, running a specific sterilization recipe for that customer, monitoring the cycle, purging the product of gas, and retrieving the product for shipment to the customer. To be a woman on any engineering team is to draw attention to yourself. STEM fields are dominated by men, and women, while not rare as hen's teeth, were a pretty rare commodity. In addition to being attractive, she was a solid engineer. She had spent 3 years in industrial processes before joining us, so she already had the confidence and general industry intelligence that many graduates lacked. This meant she wasn't easily intimidated by men taking poses. She could tell them where to stick them. I liked that about her. She wasn't my direct subordinate, but she was part of my expense account, so I watched her without interfering with her career. But sometimes, I couldn't resist observing. After about 3 months on the job, she found herself on the floor, observing a flushing procedure. In the flushing process, residual gas is removed from the chamber by pumping it out, and then the chamber is filled with air or an inert gas, such as nitrogen. This happens several times, with each subsequent flushing reducing the amount of poison inside. Of course, the exhaust gas must be vented to the atmosphere. To avoid killing all the neighbors, which would be bad for business, we heat the exhaust before it goes outside with a system called an oxidizer. Simply put, near the tailpipe, the gas is passed through a weak flame, causing traces of explosive gas in the exhaust to be safely converted into non-toxic gases, such as carbon dioxide, which we can safely release into the atmosphere. Normally, this is safe because the gas concentration was below the explosive level. But on this day, something went wrong. The night shift replaced sensors in one of the chambers and signed off on the authorization to return the equipment to service. Kristen and another engineer were on the floor, testing the device with product inside to make sure it was working properly. The replaced sensor had a faulty ground wire that shorted out after the qualification run. Long story short, Kristen and her companion had a much higher concentration of gas in the chamber than they thought, and if they did a flush, it would send it into the oxidizer. They were at ground zero next to a bomb that could destroy half the facility. If the explosion had spread to the ethylene oxide stockpile, the entire building and most of the neighborhood could have disappeared with it. We then learned that Kristen's engineer, Ken Foley, who was supposed to be mentoring her, was flirting with her while they did their work. The most idiotic part is that both were wearing chemical-resistant coveralls with protective masks and respirators. Street clothes are forbidden in the department, so it's like flirting with someone in full body armor. Nothing to see. What's the point? Save it for office hours. But it was enough to distract both of them, and they didn't notice the malfunctioning sensor going off. Ken's unprofessionalism could have led to a major industrial accident. As luck would have it, I found myself in the control room, which is a shielded cubicle overlooking the camera area. In the CR, the data stream is much more detailed than the engineers on the floor, as we have information on all the cameras, not just the one Kristen and Ken were working with. I picked up a triggered sensor in their chamber, and just as Ken was about to start the first flush, I hit the shutdown button and locked out the system before the gas could escape. I gasped, being the only one who realized at that moment how close we were all to real death and destruction. All I could do was not to wet myself on the spot. Ken put the key into the hinge again, but found himself locked out. He tried again, but this time too the system was locked. As calmly as possible, I got on speakerphone with the control room and told the two of them to leave the floor and go up to the CR for a meeting. As soon as they undressed and met me, I led them both into the conference room and repeated the events, with my hands shaking the entire time. They immediately realized how close they were to blowing up half the plant and committing suicide. I had already experienced a moment of panic in CR, and the adrenaline had finally left me. I watched in real time as Ken and Kristen experienced a moment that could have ended in an ignominious death because Ken couldn't keep it in his pants. As soon as they caught their breath, Ken started apologizing to both Kristen and me. He understood everything. He was a good engineer and realized that the slightest misstep at the wrong time on this job could be the last one in his life. I gave them both a day off to think it over, because I didn't want two overstressed people making new mistakes. But at the same time, I knew that both would learn a lesson and become better engineers. It was an expensive lesson that I didn't want to repeat, and I didn't remember it until almost 6 months later. The annual Christmas party was held at a local hotel and was a large enough event to mark the end of an eventful year. The company rented rooms for a few of us so we wouldn't have to drive home. After the party, a few people from my group went into town and visited a few bars and pubs because, why not? At one point, Kristen cornered me with shot glasses and started thanking me for saving her life. I really hadn't thought about it. I honestly told her I wasn't happy about what had happened, but pointed out that both she and Ken have become very reliable teammates and I expect them to do well in the future. One try led to several, and soon she and I were chatting at a separate table away from coworkers. I questioned her about Ken, asking if he was successfully pursuing her. She grinned and said he was charming, but she wasn't dating coworkers. 2 hours later, we were lying on the bed in our hotel room. But it didn't end there. On the first Friday of the new year, I opened the door at 9 p.m. and found Kristen there. She smelled like alcohol, but she wasn't drunk. I was more than surprised at her bold act of showing up at my door uninvited. She smirked as she entered my apartment and said she knew I was married to my job, so she could find me at home. While that was true, I also reminded her that this could be considered a date, and that I would hate for her to back out. She came close to me and ran her index finger across my sternum. I really enjoyed our Christmas party and was hoping to relive some very fond memories, she whispered. By March, we had begun an irregular FWB relationship, and although we maintained a purely platonic relationship in the office, about twice a month I made regular deposits into Kristen's bank. We kept it a secret, and as far as I knew, the office knew nothing about us. She never said if she was sleeping with anyone else, and I never asked. I made the decision to trust her based on the professionalism she displayed at work. This ended up being a mistake that doomed us to failure. After 9 months, Ken left the company, and Kristen was promoted to fill the vacated senior engineer position. Kristen was right in that I was heavily invested in the company, and there was nothing serious for me except once or twice a month, as the company was constantly taking up time I could have spent on relationships. Nevertheless, I was getting more and more used to her visits, her bottomless throat and her athletic approach to emptying my balls. Repeatedly. As usual, she took the initiative and announced that she wanted to break her vow and start dating me, exclusively and publicly. I coordinated this with the company's HR department, and she was removed from my authority. This was not easy for us because I had all the engineering managers under my direct supervision, so she had a lot of opportunity to move around the company. Shortly after this decision and the removal of restrictions on our relationship, she inspired me to take serious action. Privately, she rang all my bells. She fueled my romantic passion for her. We went on trips. I bought her gifts. She didn't need anything. Professionally, Kristen agreed to move into marketing and sales, which was new to her, and left my influence. However, she had a good mentor who gradually brought her up to speed and used her intelligence, experience, and looks to win clients. She was a real triple threat, and she loved it. She went from a supporting role to being dragged to clients for lunch, dinner, and a few trade shows. Each time, she eagerly came back to me and had fun with me. Nearly 18 months after that accident, I put a large diamond candy on her finger, and she agreed to marry me. For the first few years, marital bliss was just that. I ran the company, expanding it first once and then a second time. Profits grew steadily, and I was being rewarded what I thought was a fair amount for my efforts in the form of stock and bonuses. Kristen's career took off as well, and soon she was being invited to work for large companies. We discussed this, and I gave her the freedom to choose her career path. She decided to leave and join a multinational conglomerate. There were so many late nights and long weekends when we hardly saw each other, like ships passing in the night. But it was worth it when we connected. We didn't have kids yet, but she had just passed 30 and she started talking about how it was time to get a return on investment, so she quit the pills. 2 years later, Alexa showed up. Taking on a nanny, Kristen went back to work after her vacation and continued her climb. I adored my baby girl. I spent every night with her in my arms. We both made good money and had acquired some of the trappings of that wealth. A luxurious house in the suburbs, nice cars, and anything else Chris needed or wanted. I continued to spoil her, giving her everything she wanted. After 7 years together, Kristen brought me to the ballroom of a luxury hotel where her company was having a Christmas party. Everything was top-notch. After about 10 minutes, I heard a familiar voice. "Hi, Brian. Funny to meet you here." I turned around, and standing in front of me was Ken in a dark suit that hugged his athletic physique. This was indeed a surprise. I turned to Kristen, but she was already reaching out to hug him. Once that was done, he reached for me, squeezing my hand tightly. "What a surprise," I voiced my thoughts out loud. "Do you work here?" "Yes," he clarified. I turned to Kristen again, her graceful facial features giving nothing away. "I came here at the beginning of the year. I head up one of the engineering groups doing research on oxidizers." "Oh, that's wonderful. Kristen didn't tell me you were here." "Well, we don't work together, and she's not in engineering anymore, so I've heard," he grinned. Still a sly bastard, I thought. Chris gave me an oops smile, but didn't say anything more on the subject. "Let's get something to drink," Ken said, directing us towards the bar. My antennae were on high. I played the role of dutiful spouse while so many co-workers, enough for a small phone book, came to Chris's house to congratulate her on her latest campaign. I'd met many of them at past parties, but Chris's recent successes had made her more prominent in the company, and this was clearly her night to shine. I took it calmly. After all, the hours away from home had paid off, and she was ready for the real takeoff. Ken appeared and disappeared from the groups around us, occasionally dropping in on me to have a word or two. Apparently, he had worked for several chemical plants in the area before joining this company. He was trying to get information out of me about how we were using oxidizers and the various new developments we were working on. I wasn't about to fill him in on the details of some of the developments we were working on. We sat down at the table for dinner, and Chris found herself all alone. Not only was she the center of attention at our table, but several people came up to her to say hello and try to strike up a conversation with her. She told me she was a little surprised at all this attention. I assured her that I was proud of her. After dinner, Chris was bombarded with requests for her time, both on the dance floor and when discussing new projects. Several times she pulled away from me, throwing me, "I'm sorry, what can I do," looks, but I just waved and let her go. Ken continued to flutter around, taking various women to the dance floor where he moved confidently. Chris would come back and pull away again, sighing. At one point, she insisted on being left for a few minutes with her husband. The plaintiff pulled away, apologizing. "I'm sorry, honey," she said, overlapping the noise of the orchestra. "I really wasn't expecting this, but at the same time, I'm pleased to be recognized." "Don't worry, sweetheart. Alexa and I are proud of you." She smelled of alcohol and sweat. "I'll do it with you upstairs later," she grinned. She quickly pulled away and I headed towards the bar with a sigh. I didn't drink anymore, as I didn't want to lose control of myself and wanted to be able to perform. I was 10 years older than Chris, so if I wanted to keep up with her Olympic desire, I needed to plan ahead. I lost sight of her for about 20 minutes, but found myself engaged in conversation with the head of the microbiology department, whom I knew from several professional organizations. He and I chatted in a more social setting, as we both felt that store talk was best left for business hours. We were planning to meet for a drink when Chris slipped in beside me, a little out of breath. "There you are," she said, hugging me from behind. "I'm tired of all this shit. Don't you want to have baby number 2 upstairs?" "Looks like our reunion will have to wait," my coworker said. Laughing, I wished my coworker a Merry Christmas and agreed to meet up in the new year. As we rode the elevator up to our room, Chris was all over me. I could smell cigarette smoke and something else besides booze and sweat. I put it off for later. But Chris, true to her word, wouldn't let me rest until I had emptied my balls into her dripping saliva 3 times and leisurely drank a fourth before breakfast. Chris was very convincing. She announced in February that she was expecting a baby, and our son Henley was born in early September. It was Chris's show again at this party. Not as saucy as last year, but this year Chris seems to have bought into her own press clippings. Last year's demure Chris was replaced by an overbearing and arrogant version that looked every bit the bitch she was dressed to be. Several times she left me alone for 10 minutes or more, while she met with important people. Worse was when she blatantly ignored me when I was around her. This year, Ken showed up at the party and seemed to get much closer to Chris. Something was definitely not right. The dinner was a mess. More and more important, people were walking by and Chris hardly spoke to me or ate any of her food. I got the one and only pity dance during the dance while she was on the floor with Ken most of the time. I couldn't even cut in, as they would step aside at the sight of me. It was too much. I left the bitch there and went home. There I looked in on each of my sleeping children. I loved them very much, and no matter what happened that night, I loved Chris for bringing them into this world with me. I needed to keep that in mind as I reflected on her behavior during the night's events. I was home for about an hour before she noticed my absence, but then the calls and texts started, including one from Ken. I deleted them all and turned my phone off. Close to 2 in the morning, Chris burst through the door screaming from the foyer about what an asshole her husband was. She quieted down, but soon was practically yelling at me again for leaving her. She looked like a sloppy drunk. If she felt that bad, I knew she was about to pass out. I dragged her to the breakfast room, which was as far away from the children's rooms as possible so her screams wouldn't wake them up. She mocked me, talking about my manhood, how weak I was, and how this relationship had always been on her mind. I listened as she talked about what she was doing for me and the fact that she already had a line of men lined up wanting to be with her tonight. I'd been there. I'd seen it. I kept quiet on purpose, knowing she'd get tired of drinking. It would all be over soon and I'd carry her to bed. But then she started talking about Ken and how wonderful he was, how good he was to her, and how things might have been different if she had chosen him over me almost 10 years ago. It hurt, and there was something about it that always bothered me. I knew she was ranting. I knew she was drunk and trying to hurt me, but there was always something about Ken that kept me going. Mentally, I was also waiting for her to start belittling me for my success in bed. But surprisingly, that didn't happen. As was her habit, she quickly ran out of breath. Using up the last of her strength to scream, she soon collapsed to the floor. I picked her up in my arms and carried her upstairs. She reeked of alcohol, sweat, and men's cologne, no doubt from her dancing. I took off her shoes and laid her on the bed. I didn't undress her, that would take effort, and frankly I was tired, and the bitch didn't deserve that kind of effort. Let her ruin her dress by sleeping in it. I hope she also throws up on it for extra convincing. I went to sleep in the guest room. I woke up with an excruciating morning country pain. It felt weird sleeping in a different bed. "Oh, you're awake," Chris whispered. "The kids left with the babysitter, and I brought you breakfast in bed." Over a simple breakfast, she apologized, saying that work took up too much of her time, that she got all this recognition and praise, and after a while it was hard not to buy into it. It's a job, and you have to pay a certain amount of money for it. Pay for contacts, and how she hated that part of the job. She knew how to work and was happy just doing it. If she could avoid extraneous noises, she was happy to lock her office door and not come out of there until she got home at the end of the day. "You came home last night and you smelled like cologne," I remarked, keeping my eyes on her to follow her reaction. "Snake, I'm surprised I didn't smell like a dozen different kinds. You saw me on the dance floor. I wasn't dancing. I was accessorizing the higher powers, and that was one of the fees I had to pay. I told you I hated it." "Then go away," I reasoned. "We don't need the money, and you can always use your skills elsewhere. You're not the only one who gets hurt by this, you know." "I'm sorry it's come to this, but I'm almost to the point where it's over, where I can be free of it and, yes, maybe go my own way." Her face was still as beautiful as I knew it would be, and her eyes looked up at me as she asked me to bear with her a little longer. That was enough for me. "And Ken, I have a really bad feeling about this. A little irritated. Let me deal with him, please. We didn't raise our voices in anger, and for the moment we had come to an agreement satisfactory enough for both of us to be a happy family again. But it was actually the beginning of the end. In the new year, Chris began to distance herself from us, spending more and more time at the office. At least twice a week she would come in after 9 p.m., looking tired and exhausted. She would eat a few spoonfuls of food and go to bed. With me, she was tolerant, but not as loving a spouse as I expected. I spent more time with the kids to compensate and gave her small gifts like flowers at the office or a Saturday spa day where she could relax. Maybe twice a week we managed to socialize in bed. But even there, she didn't show herself. It was just foreplay until I came home one night in June. It wasn't that easy that night because I got home a little late, around 7 p.m., and Chris was already home. I arrived to catch the babysitter putting the kids to bed and Chris getting dressed. She looked stunning. Light makeup, hair done, manicure, stiletto shoes. Am I forgetting something? I asked. She shook her head. No. What's the occasion? I'm going for a walk, she said, as if that answered all questions. Obviously it didn't, but before I could discuss it further, the doorbell rang. She looked at the watch I had bought her for our 5th anniversary. She nodded, saying, "Can you take it? It's for you." I looked at her puzzled. The second bell rang and I moved toward the door. It was opened by a middle-aged man in a slightly worn suit. "Brian Wally?" "Yes." "You've been served," he said. "Excuse me." Handing me a manila envelope, he turned on his heel and walked away. What the hell? I picked my jaw up and went back inside. Pulling out the papers, I realized Chris was divorcing me. "I'm going to be very fair, Bree. We can divide the property and you'll be left—" "What the hell is this, Chris?" I interrupted. "Some kind of sick joke?" She pulled on her shoes, emphasizing her muscular legs. Her face softened and she looked sad, but not upset. Not as if her heart had been ripped out of her. Not as if her world was crumbling around her. It was all on my conscience. This was my night. How to realize that the life you knew was a lie. "I'm sorry, Brian." She clenched her hands into fists, but that was just the limit of her feelings. "I'm really sorry, but we had our way and this is what's best for everyone." How is it best for me? How am I supposed to accept this? I was on the verge of hysterics. Tears were flowing freely and my heart was pounding in my chest. My thoughts were so scattered that I could barely form a coherent sentence. My wife, my love, was gone. While I was panicking, the doorbell rang again. Chris opened, and I tried in vain to wipe the tears from my face. But they were getting bigger and bigger, and the snot coming out of my nose made me feel like a preschooler. From the foyer came the quiet voices of a man and Chris. I turned around. Sure enough, Ken was in one of his custom-made suits and was kissing my wife on the cheek. "I'm sorry, Brian," he said. "It's just the way it is." Again, as if that explained everything. Closing the door, Chris took his hand and led him inside. "Get him out of my house," I hissed, turning up the volume until I shouted the last word. "No, Brian, I want him here." They looked at each other and then at me. "Look, Brian, you didn't do anything. It's just—" "For how long?" I sobbed. Chris looked a little nervous. Always. What? My brain wasn't working fast enough to realize the enormity of what I'd been told. "Better just take the blindfold off, honey," Ken said, stroking her shoulder and guiding her over to the couch where they both sat down. I was ready to rip his damn arm out. "All right, Brian, this isn't going to be easy or pleasant for you, but please sit down," Chris said softly, in a tone I would have once taken for love. I sat down. I always did that when I was nervous. "No, I'm going to stand. Speak up, and let's get this over with." "Again, I'm sorry about that, but I need to deal with this." "Brian, today is the 10th anniversary of you saving Ken and me from the explosion at the plant. None of us can thank you enough for what you did. But that day after the meeting, you sent us home. We left work, but because of the adrenaline rush and the feeling of near death, we walked home together. I was so happy to be alive. We were both happy. I went home that day, tried to forget about it, and went back to work the next day. Both Ken and I felt something that day, but I decided it was just that, a one-off sensation. I avoided it for a few days, but he convinced me to try it again, but without the adrenaline and everything that comes with it. This time it was even better. We sat there after that second time, both happy but also sad at the same time from being so close to losing everything. We knew we owed it to ourselves. So we came up with a plan. I'm going to sleep with you to repay you for saving us. We knew you liked me, from all the looks you threw at me in the office. But we didn't tell you why, and that first night I found out on my own. We both knew it was going to be a long-term project to pay you back, and we both plunged headfirst into it with the foolish enthusiasm of youth and the realization that we were smarter than everyone else. The more we were together, the more we realized how much we owed you, so we settled on a number. 10 years, I said, looking at the two monsters disguised as humans on my couch. They both nodded. Ken stroked her shoulder, reassuring her. I am willing to give you 10 years of love and affection in payment for the debt we owe you. And now we have finalized our bargain and ask you to respect our desire to move on with our lives. For the good of all. Respect? Respect? I growled. What the hell do you know about respect? I respect the shit I took this morning more than I respect the two of you right now. Chris, come on. There has to be some. Don't you feel anything for me? Ken's hand removed from her shoulders and she straightened up. Don't be silly, Brian, she sighed. She looked at Ken and he nodded. This was all planned. Brian, She paused. We both owe you so much, and I've always genuinely loved and respected the way you saved and provided for me. But every day for the past 10 years, I have belonged to Ken. Brian, Ken continued, grinning, we're both immensely grateful to you, but there's no point in continuing to lie. You're young enough to find someone else and start over. Alexa and Henley should be with their father. Damn it, it felt like a physical blow. I staggered back, muttering, leaning on the chair for balance. I ran DNA on both of them, and they're both Ken's. Chris and I gave you a little extra to compensate for raising my kids, but it's time for me to take responsibility for my fertility. We want more, and we won't wait. I walked away. Mentally, I was out. A decade of betrayal. The shattering of my hopes for happiness and family. The deception on their part. The way the evening had been planned and executed in cold blood. It was devastating. It guaranteed that I wouldn't fight to reconcile and let them make a quick and clean exit while I cleaned up the mess in my life. Physically, I needed to leave before I did something irreversible. Walking up the stairs and into my bedroom, I packed my life into my suitcases. As I heard the front door close, I realized I had a little time. I checked again what I needed and realized that I had been on my way since I had been told. I sighed and sat down on the bed, our bed, which I assume was never mine. I thought for a minute and realized that I needed to take steps to put all of this behind me as soon as possible. I called the plant manager, my attorney, and my brother, letting them know what had happened. I pulled myself together as best I could. I had been played, and I was far behind. I got approval to file for divorce, a job transfer to the other side of the country, and a person to meddle in family matters until I was cured. I packed up my car, left my wedding ring on the kitchen table, and went upstairs one last time. I spent 10 minutes looking down at each child I considered my own and my legacy. It didn't matter whose genetics they were made of. They were a part of me, and I would always love them. Next chapter. And that's where I came here from, he said. He raised his glass as a sign that despite the physical displacement, the mental side of the incident still haunted Brian. Throughout the story, Korax remained virtually motionless. At the end, he remained motionless and then blinked. Coming back to reality, Korax straightened up. Brian, I rarely lose my breath, but the story you told me is really beyond what I usually encounter when dealing with people. He sipped his tea and took a sip, ignoring the fact that it had managed to get cold during Brian's story. And afterward? He asked, afraid to push Brian too hard. Not really. I pieced together some moments that didn't make sense at the time. Chris and Ken entertained at least twice a week throughout their marriage. He even had a private room in the hotel where we played the wedding. After the Christmas party, she quit her job and moved to a new company, so I couldn't file a debt collection suit against her company. Of course, she never told me about it. I haven't spoken to or heard from the kids since then in almost 10 years, and I'm not sure I want to now. Alexa will barely remember me, and Henley won't even remember me at all. It's best to leave that lie alone, he said quietly. I don't trust women in any personal relationships. I've been alone since that night, and I have no desire to be with a woman again, intimate or not. I guess I don't trust myself, you know? Brian felt strange. Yes, this story was horrible. It had been perpetrated by two evil men who lacked humanity, whatever reasons they gave for their horrible behavior. But enough time had passed, and he had relived it so many times in his head, alone. To express it all to Korax, who was as neutral and unattached a listener as possible, was, in a word, liberating. The strange feeling Brian was experiencing was freedom. Well, Brian, I'm touched by your story. I don't have much time today, but I hope to return soon. But before I go, I must ask a few questions. I hope they'll be brief and not make you too anxious during this difficult time. No, that's fine. Talking to you has been very therapeutic. I've never told this story to anyone but my brother and my lawyer. I appreciate you letting me tell it all. You're a good listener and a good friend. Korax looked at Brian. Korax tilted his head and smiled relaxedly, hiding his yellow teeth. I like that, Brian. Thank you. Brian, don't you want to see the kids again? To talk to them? If you could. Brian wasn't prepared for such a question. He thought for a moment. No. No, I don't think so. I think whatever awaits them in life right now, I don't know. Except that they were innocent of it. And I hope they weren't touched by their horrible parents. I still love them and hope for the best. I understand, the tall man said. In light of events, that is a very commendable sentiment. As Korax got ready to leave, Brian wished him a happy journey and asked about Groom. The tall man turned and, tilting his head, addressed Brian in a strange manner. Yes, Groom sends his regards and thanks for your concern. Would you like to meet again sometime? I have a proposition for you. Brian nodded. Sure. I will contact you shortly with a time and place. Korax nodded and left the yard, ducking as he crossed the threshold. Next chapter. The following Friday, Brian's cell phone rang, the number untraceable. Hello? Hi, Brian. This is Korax. Groom and I are in town, and we were wondering if we could meet you tonight. The thought of the fact that he never gave Korax his phone number was mildly disturbing. Brian had nothing but the yard on his schedule, so he agreed and planned an early dinner. At 8 p.m. in the park, located 3 blocks from the yard and near the waterfront, Brian sat down on a bench in one of the most secluded corners of the park. The lanterns overhead illuminated the scene, and Korax in his coat seemed made of shadow and darkness. Beside him, in the grass, lay a medium-sized dog of indistinguishable breed. It was shaggy and ungroomed, its coat mottled with shades of tan, white, and gray. Both Korax and the dog watched Brian walk toward them, but neither made a move until Brian approached. Remembering Korax's habit, Brian repeated, "May I join you?" The tall man smiled understandingly and gestured for him to sit on the bench next to him. From his coat pocket, Brian pulled out a silver vacuum thermos. He held it out to the tall man, who accepted it, raising an eyebrow almost to his hairline. Hello, Korax. I brought you some tea since we're not at the yardarm. I was worried I didn't have a second cup for Groom, but he's not joining us, is he? Oh, Groom's here, he said, gesturing to the dog. There's nothing wrong with tea. He's not an amateur. Brian sighed. He knew now that Korax was a psycho. It had always been obvious. Unconventional clothes, odd mannerisms, careless formal speech. Well, it's a nice evening and Korax isn't violent, so he relented and sat down. Brian, in my role, I've seen the best and worst sides of humanity, and indeed, everything in the world. I don't see enough goodness. Such is the nature of the role, and such is the burden that comes with it. I accept it gladly. But you have shown me kindness. Kindness in your friendship, in your manner of speaking to someone like me when most other people would have just brushed me off. And compassion for those you've never even met like Groom. Groom rose from the ground and sat up in a sitting position, panting slightly but looking at me. No, you had little reason to be kind and merciful, but you were nonetheless. And for that, I was allowed to do you one favor. A chance, so to speak. It came at a high price, but I think few people I've met would have deserved the opportunity more than you. Korax opened the thermos and poured some tea into a cup with a lid. In the light of the sodium lamp, the tea steamed. He saluted Brian with the cup before taking a sip. Brian felt uncomfortable. Korax was nuts, that much was obvious. But as he spoke, his voice grew deeper. No, that wasn't the right word. There was more presence in his voice, as if he was speaking from a chest of a completely different size or shape. At the same time, there was a confidence in it, as if a sweet warmth surrounded him, amber and calm as Korak spoke. The stable boy wagged his tail, but otherwise remained still. If I may be a bit pompous, but I think I have some explaining to do. You're not alone, Brian, and I mean that in a very cosmic sense. This universe and everything in it is one of countless, countless existences. Each one of them is a little pearl, self-sufficient and whole. They are themselves contained within a larger space. Brian wasn't too pleased. If Korax was going to spout some crazy nonsense about time and space, he was already regretting having decided to come. Groom stood up and walked over to Brian, sitting down across from him. Staring at the dog, Brian gasped when Groom spoke. Hello, Brian Wally. We haven't been formally introduced to each other, but I'm Groom. I thank you for the good wishes you sent through Korax. The concepts Korax is talking to you about are very important, but you may need support to understand some of them. The whole conversation was going on in Brian's head. All of Groom's thoughts and ideas were appearing in Brian's head at the same time, as if Groom and he were already talking, and the dialogue was a memory and not spoken aloud. It was just there in his head. Groom was not a talking dog. Talking dogs don't exist. Groom was something much scarier. And that before Brian could get a word out, something big and black flew out of Groom's mouth, followed by another, and another, and another, and another, until something that looked like a dozen spikes stretched Groom's upper jaw so that it was pointing skyward, separating completely from the lower jaw. Groom's fanged head crawled backwards, the spikes slowly diverging from the center. This continued until the dogskin reached the obstacle. There was a small pop and the leather and fur crawled back, exposing the knuckles on one of the spikes. More knuckles appeared on the other spikes. The spikes with exposed knuckles bent and rested on the ground. They were articulated legs. Now that Groom could keep his balance, his dogskin slid off much more easily, revealing something Brian wasn't meant to see. Groom had come to this dimension from a place where things like him made sense, and he had come to this world through the body of a dog. Brian's pulse pulsed in his arteries, and he wondered if Korax's madness had been passed on to him. If this was what Korax had seen, it was no wonder the man had gone insane. Coco Korax? He glanced back at the bench and saw the man sipping his tea, watching the horrifying sight before him. Showing off, now you see why I don't often take him out in public, was all Korax said. Brian was terrified to look at Groom's ghastly form, but at the same time impossible to disobey the compulsion. Less than a yard away from Brian stood the nightmare of nightmares. Groom was black, about 10 feet tall and nearly 30 feet long, completely covered in a shiny black carapace. It was close to a praying mantis and a spider in its combination of body parts. But there were too many legs and eyes. A thorax with neck and head was topped with vibrating antennae sticking out of the top of its head. A cruel beak peered out of its mouth, from which yellowish saliva dripped beneath the huge mass. But the more Brian looked, the less he saw. None of it made sense. Brian couldn't pick up any human features except that some short legs ended in three-toed arms that bent and unbent in a complex rhythm. This only confused the situation further. Panicked and speechless, Brian looked at Korax again, trying to keep on the other side of the madness. Brian Wally, I'm only showing you this to make you realize how little you understand about the things around you. You're in no danger, and you're in no danger, Grum said, in his head all at once again. The same Grium who had become a dog again. Gone were the intense insect-like hallucinations that had nearly caused Brian to empty his bladder. Grium walked over to Korax and returned to a sitting position. It's like I said, Brian, calling this reality a multiverse is doing it dishonestly. There are actually a lot of realities. But the thing is, Groom and I would like to help you. We're limited in what we can do, and there's a small window in which we can make adjustments. Every self-contained reality has a beginning and an end. They are separated by what you might consider time. There is a direction in which things move. Cause begets effect, and so on. However, time itself introduces disruptions to this flow. There is no fate or master plan. Each universe evolves uniquely according to the events that occur, and time is the regulator of those events. Each of these regulated possibilities gives rise to a new set of possibilities, which in turn give rise to their own set of possibilities. and so on. Brian could understand that. He loved popular science books on astronomy, the universe, and cosmology. Korax described the theory of multiple worlds of the universe, but did so with the assurance that it was all real. Since Brian had been sitting on that bench, it was probably the least crazy thing he had seen or heard. Right now, new universes are being born out of this universe. All it takes is a single atomic particle that moves left instead of right after a collision to spawn a new element of the collective. All possibilities are real, all are being explored. All are connected, like parents or children in a real and tangible cluster of time and energy, like a collective. Groom and I have our own role in this. My role in this is unique to those members of the collective who had the conditions for life to emerge. Life, especially life capable of realizing its condition, is relatively rare, and it occurs because of a unique energy. Soul? Nothing complicated, I'm afraid. There is no heaven, and you will not live forever. But you already know that. It is energy, but energy with a trace going to higher dimensions beyond your part of the collective. My role in this is to move your energies out of the cage you are in. You would say cross over. Groom directs that energy through the networks connecting the various universes within the collective to your destination. And to where? Not here, Korax grinned. Your death. Like death with a capital letter. No, not at all. Korax paused, hesitating. Do you remember your mythology? Brian nodded. A good analogy would be the Greeks' idea of Charon, the ferryman who escorted the dead to Hades. He wasn't death, but he was part of the experience. I will be Charon, and Groom will be the boat that takes you from this part of the collective to the area that requires your energies. We are different aspects of the collective psychopomp. Holy shit, this is unreal. Brian began to hyperventilate and grabbed the bench. Easy, easy, Brian. Korax patted him on the back encouragingly. Part of the reason we're telling you this is because we believe you can realize the magnitude of what we're telling you. The other part is that time is fixed here. What has passed in this space cannot be changed. However, from the perspective of this universe, every other possible part of the collective is, shall we say, adjustable? Brian began to realize. And that would result in a rewrite? All possible and subsequent spawns of this event except for the origin. Korax's concerned smirk reflected on Brian's smirk. It seemed logical to Brian. It completely ruled out the grandfather paradox in this universe. And what's the price? Your energy so I can move you across the membrane, and Groom can step out of this collective reality and run your particular event into the network. There's always a price to pay. Brian nodded. That was fair enough. How do you do it? Korax reached into his pocket and pulled out an old early-generation cell phone, about the size of a paperback book and with a rigid antenna. When? When would you like? Next chapter? Brian finished his scrambled eggs and was about to leave when suddenly there was a knock on his apartment door. Glancing at the clock, he realized it was 7 in the morning. The staff was on schedule. He walked to the door and let in a tall man in black clothes and his shaggy dog. He greeted them warmly. Tea for Korax and scrambled eggs for Groom. You ready, Brian? The two voices harmonized in his head, making bittersweet music. For a moment, Brian saw a large but friendly raven in front of him. Brushing away the tears, Brian nodded. Is this going to hurt? Much less than it already hurts you, the voices replied. Brian tensed. Please have a seat. Brian led them both into the living room and motioned for them to sit on the couch. Taking a deep breath, he looked at the two people in monster costumes sitting on the couch. All right, I'm ready. Korax rummaged through his overcoat looking for a phone and handed the receiver to Brian. There was only one button on the phone. God, this technology is something. He grinned with tears in his eyes. Korax smiled softly and Groom wagged his tail. He pressed the button and waited for a response. After a short conversation, the call ended and he handed the phone back to Korax. Thank you both so much. I'm happy to finish this. Thank you, Brian. Their voices rang out. Be cool. They were right. This wasn't going to hurt. Next chapter. Brian picked up the phone, angry that he was already late, but someone was calling him at 7:12 on a Tuesday morning to make him late. Great, he muttered. Taking the handset off the wireless charger, He answered the call. Hello? He barked into the receiver. You had a crush on Paula Ventrone in high school, but you didn't tell anyone. You freaked out on prom night when she confessed she'd always wanted you to ask her out. The voice in the phone was oddly familiar, similar to his brother's voice, but not quite the same. Older. Who the hell is that? Brian was shocked. No one knew about this, ever. You know who it is. Call me today. Do anything but come. Why? Don't do it. The caller then read out a series of numbers. What are these? Write them down. That's Paula Ventrone's phone number. She still wants to hear from you. And the call ended. Brian sat staring at the phone in his hand. For a minute, he looked around the room, then picked up the phone again. Sometime after lunch, Brian received another call. The caller identified himself as a member of the plant's emergency response network. There had been an explosion at the plant that had killed 2 engineers who had improperly vented air from one of the chambers. They need him immediately, if at all possible. Brian grabbed his jacket and headed out the door. It looked like his date with Paula would have to be postponed for a day or two. The end. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Subscribe to my channel and watch for the next video.